Picture this. It's a Saturday afternoon in 1987. A 12-year-old comes home from school, drops their backpack by the door, makes themselves a peanut butter sandwich, and sits in front of the TV alone. No one asks how their day was, no one checks their homework. Mom's at work, dad might be at work, or he might just not be around anymore. And you know what? That kid doesn't spiral. They don't call a helpline. They flip on Saved by the Bell, eat their sandwich, and figure it out. That kid grew up to be a Gen Xer, and there is an entire psychological universe hidden inside that Saturday afternoon. So here's the question I want to explore with you today. Why does Generation X seem so psychologically different? Not broken, not cynical for no reason, but genuinely wired in a way that baffles other generations. Why can they succeed in near total silence? Why do they seem allergic to praise? Why does external validation feel to so many of them like a costume that doesn't quite fit? The answer isn't attitude, it's architecture. It's what happened to their brains during the most formative years of their lives. Let's go there. Generation X, broadly speaking, covers people born between 1965 and 1980. They grew up sandwiched between the enormous cultural gravity of the baby boomers and the digitally native millennials. But here's the thing. While everyone was watching those two generations, Gen X was just quietly doing their own thing. And that invisibility, it wasn't accidental. It was trained into them.
Psychologists talk a lot about something called self-determination theory, developed by researchers Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. The theory says human beings have three core psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Now here's where it gets interesting for Gen X specifically. They got a massive, involuntary overdose of autonomy in childhood, and very little of the other two. They were the latchkey generation, the generation of unsupervised afternoons, of parents preoccupied with their own divorces and second mortgages, of teachers who were stretched thin and couldn't give them individualized attention even if they wanted to. So they built their competence in isolation. They figured things out not because someone cheered them on, but because no one else was going to do it for them. What does that do to a developing brain? A lot, actually. When children learn that their efforts are not reliably met with external reward, they make a psychological pivot. They start to internalize their motivation. In behavioral psychology, this is the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Gen X, by circumstance, was pushed hard toward intrinsic motivation. They did things because they found meaning in them, not because they expected a trophy at the finish line. And look, that sounds healthy, and in many ways it absolutely is, but it also means that when applause does arrive, it can feel foreign, uncomfortable, even suspicious.
Think about that for a second. Think about what it means to build an entire motivational framework in the absence of consistent external feedback. You stop expecting it, and then, this is the psychological kicker, you stop needing it. Not in a repressed way, not in a I'm fine way that secretly isn't fine, but genuinely. The internal reward circuit becomes dominant. The feeling of doing something well becomes its own currency. That's remarkable. That's also a little lonely. Because here's the shadow side of that coin. Gen X can struggle deeply with receiving care, with being vulnerable, with asking for help. When your entire psychological development was built around self-sufficiency, interdependence can feel almost structurally wrong, like trying to walk on a leg that healed slightly crooked. It works, it just doesn't work the way other people's does. Now, layer on top of this something researchers call cohort effects, the idea that the shared historical experiences of a generation shape their psychology in lasting ways. Gen X came of age during the AIDS crisis, the Cold War's final exhale, stagflation, and the culture wars of the 80s. They watched institutions fail, churches, governments, corporations, families, and psychologically, what do you do when the structures you were supposed to trust collapse or disappoint? You develop what's called a low-trust orientation. You become skeptical, not because you're bitter, but because experience taught you that skepticism is protective. It's adaptive. It makes complete sense. This is why Gen X humor is the way it is. dry, sardonic, self-deprecating before anyone else can be. That's not just a cultural aesthetic. That's a psychological defense mechanism turned into an art form. It says, I see the absurdity of everything, including myself, and I refuse to be caught off guard by any of it. There's something genuinely brilliant about that, and something genuinely heartbreaking, too. There's a concept in psychology called emotional suppression versus emotional regulation, and the line between them matters enormously. Suppression is when you bury feelings because you believe they're dangerous or unwelcome. Regulation is when you process feelings, put them in context, and move forward. A lot of Gen Xers were trained in suppression, not because their parents were monsters, but because their parents were overwhelmed humans in a system that didn't value emotional literacy. So they learned to be fine, always fine, even when they weren't. And yet, here is the paradox that I find genuinely beautiful about this generation. Despite all of that suppression, despite the isolation and the skepticism and the distrust of institutions, Gen X produced an extraordinary cultural output. Grunge, hip-hop's golden era, independent film, the original hacker culture, the foundational internet architecture. These weren't people doing things for applause. These were people creating because it was the only honest thing to do, because the internal compulsion was stronger than any external reward could ever be. That's not despite their psychology. That is their psychology, fully expressed. So what do we take from all of this? I think it starts with understanding that the Gen X way of being in the world is not a wound that needs healing, even though some parts of it genuinely do. It's a blueprint that was shaped by specific conditions, and like any blueprint, it has both its strengths and its structural quirks. The capacity for independence is extraordinary. The resilience is real, but so is the loneliness that can come from never having learned how to lean. So is the quiet exhaustion of always being the person who figures it out, who doesn't need anything, who is always fine. If you're a Gen Xer watching this, maybe something here sounds familiar in your bones. Maybe you've spent your whole life achieving in a kind of internal silence, not quite sure why the praise feels hollow, even when it's sincere. That's not a character flaw. That's the story your nervous system was given, chapter by chapter, before you even knew you were being written. And if you're someone who loves a Gen Xer, understand that the silence isn't rejection. The self-sufficiency isn't coldness. They are simply operating on a frequency that was tuned very early to a station with no signal, and they learned to make music anyway. That's worth thinking about. That's worth the comment down below, whether you're a Gen Xer yourself, whether you raised one, whether you love one. Tell me what landed for you. And if you want to keep going deeper into the psychology of generations, identity, and what makes us who we are, subscribe because we're just getting started.